Hey there, ready for another deep dive. Today it's all about climate change, and wow, you guys sent in a ton of research this time. Looks like we're going for a real deep understanding of the basics.
Yeah, exactly. We're gonna cut through all the confusing stuff and really break down the science behind all those terms you hear everywhere these days.
Awesome. So let's jump right in. Something I always see getting mixed up is like weather versus climate. What's the difference and why does it even matter when we talk about climate change?
You're right. That difference is super important. Think about it this way, like the rain, the sunshine, the wind you see outside your window right now, that's the weather, the short-term stuff. But climate, that's like zooming out and seeing the big picture, the average weather patterns over a long time, like 30 years or even more. So climate change, it's not just about one hot summer. It's about changes in those long-term averages.
So it's like one hot day doesn't mean climate change, but a whole bunch of hotter years in a row, that's a sign, right? Okay, I see something here called Earth's energy budget in this climate change resource book. What is that all about?
It's all about balance, really. It's like, imagine the Earth has a bank account, sunlight is the money coming in, and the heat radiating back out into space is the expense. The energy budget is about keeping those in balance so the Earth stays at a temperature where we can all live.
I see. So like we need to make sure we're not spending more than we're earning, basically.
Yeah, basically. And that's where the greenhouse effect comes in.
Ah, the greenhouse effect. Everyone's talking about it. But to be honest, it's always been kind of fuzzy for me. Can we break it down?
Sure. Imagine the Earth is wrapped in a blanket. That's the atmosphere, right? And some gases, like carbon dioxide and methane, act like the insulation in that blanket. They trap some heat and keep the Earth warm. That's the natural greenhouse effect, and we need it. Like, without it, the Earth would be freezing.
So we need this blanket.
Mm.
But it's when it gets too thick that things get too hot.
Right. When we have more of those gases, that blanket gets thicker. It traps more heat than usual. That's what's called the enhanced greenhouse effect, and that's what's driving global warming.
And we humans are, like, adding extra layers to that blanket with all the fossil fuels we're burning, right?
You got it. Burning stuff like coal and oil and gas releases a ton of these greenhouse gases into the atmosphere.
So it's like we've messed with the Earth's thermostat without even realizing it. But how do we know for sure it's us? Couldn't it be, like, natural changes in the climate?
Well, there are natural things that affect the climate, like volcanoes and changes in the sun's energy. But the science is pretty clear. Human activities are the main cause of the warming we're seeing now.
Okay, so what's the evidence for that?
Well, we have temperature records going back to the 1880s, and they show a clear pattern. The Earth has been warming up, especially since the Industrial Revolution, which is, when we started burning a lot more fossil fuels.
So the timing kind of lines up perfectly there.
Right. And we also have these things called climate models, which are like really complex computer simulations of how the Earth's climate works. And what's interesting is those models can only accurately predict the warming we've seen when they include human factors like, our greenhouse gas emissions.
Wow, so we're seeing this warming trend in the real data and in these simulations. That's, like, pretty convincing. Is there anything else we're seeing out in the world that points to this warming trend?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Think about all the ice on the planet, like glaciers and the Arctic sea ice. They're melting at a scary rate, which is, definitely a sign of a warming world.
And what about sea level rise? I keep hearing about that too.
That's a big one. As the planet warms, the water in the ocean actually expands, taking up more space, which makes the sea level rise. Plus, all that melting ice from the glaciers and ice sheets, that adds even more water to the oceans.
So it's kind of a double whammy, expanding water and melting ice. Okay, this is all a little unsettling. What about weather patterns? Are those changing too?
Global precipitation patterns are, they're pretty complex, but we are seeing shifts in some regions. Some places are getting way more intense rainfall, which leads to more flooding, while other places are getting hit with, like, way more droughts.
So basically, it's messing with everything. We've covered a lot. Weather versus climate, the evidence for human-caused warming, and all these changes we're
Yeah.
seeing. Can we talk more about these climate models? What exactly are they, and why are they so important?
Yeah, climate models are like super powerful tools. They're these really complex computer programs that scientists use to simulate the Earth's climate. It's like a virtual lab where they can test different scenarios and see how the climate might change in the future.
So they can be like, what if we keep doing what we're doing? Or what if we make some big changes?
Exactly. By changing different factors in the model, like how much greenhouse gas we emit, they can get a sense of what might happen. It helps us understand what we're facing and what we can do about it.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like having a sneak peek into the future of our planet.
Hmm.
Okay, but what about the economic side of things? Does climate change have a price tag?
Oh, it absolutely does. Climate change can hit our economies hard. Think about extreme weather like hurricanes and wildfires.
Yeah, those cause a lot of damage, right?
A lot. They can damage buildings and roads, disrupt businesses, and, the costs of rebuilding after those events, that adds up. And it's not just the immediate damage, there are also long-term costs.
Like what?
Well, think about sea level rise. As the sea level goes up, it can damage and destroy property, especially in coastal areas.
Mm.
And that can affect things like real estate values, insurance rates, and even force people to move away from their homes.
Yeah, so it's not just about cleaning up after a storm, it's about the long-term consequences too. This is like way more complex than I realized.
It really is. It's not just an environmental problem, it's an economic problem and a social problem, too. Understanding these economic costs is really important when we think about how to, you know, deal with climate change.
This has been super helpful. I feel like I'm starting to get the big picture now. Climate change doesn't just affect the environment, it affects everything.
That's great to hear. And there's still so much more to explore. In part 2, we'll dig into what we can actually do about climate change. The solutions, like what actions we can take to address this huge global challenge.
Can't wait. Sounds fascinating. Welcome back. Last time, we really dug into the science behind climate change and even touched on some of the economic stuff. But now I'm really interested to hear about the solutions.
Yeah, we're diving into climate action today, specifically 2 main strategies: mitigation and adaptation.
Mitigation and adaptation, those sound kind of intense. What do they even mean when we're talking about climate change?
Okay, so think of it this way. Mitigation, that's like our offense. It's about tackling the root of the problem, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, turning down the heat. And adaptation, well, that's our defense. It's how we deal with the changes that are already happening and prepare for future impacts like sea level rise and all those crazy weather events.
Okay, I get it. So mitigation is like stopping the problem from getting worse, and adaptation is like learning to live with the changes we can't avoid.
Exactly.
So let's start with mitigation. What are some of the big ways we can cut down on emissions?
Well, one of the biggest things we can do is change how we get our energy. Right now, we're super dependent on fossil fuels, which is, the main problem. We need to switch to cleaner sources like solar, wind, hydropower, that kind of stuff.
I see a lot more solar panels around these days, but can we really power the whole world with just those kinds of sources?
We totally can. The technology for renewable energy has gotten so much better, and the costs have come down a lot. We have the potential to power, everything, our homes, businesses, even entire cities with clean energy.
That's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
What about energy efficiency? I try to turn off lights and unplug stuff, but it feels like a tiny thing to do.
Yeah, individual actions are important, but we need bigger changes too, like better insulation in buildings so they don't waste energy, or designing cars and trucks that use less fuel, and smarter energy grids that can move energy around more efficiently.
So it's got to be both. Personal choices and big infrastructure changes.
Right.
What about stuff beyond energy? I know agriculture is a big part of this too, right?
Yeah, agriculture is a big contributor to emissions. Cutting down forests for farmland, raising livestock, all that releases a lot of greenhouse gases.
So what can we do about that? Should we all become vegetarians?
Well, dietary choices can help, but there are other things too. Like we can support more sustainable farming methods, things like agroforestry, which is basically combining trees and agriculture, and no-till farming, which helps store carbon in the soil.
So it's about working with nature instead of against it.
Exactly.
I've also heard a lot about reducing food waste. How does that play into all this?
Food waste is a huge problem. And it's not just about the wasted food itself. It's all the resources that go into growing it, transporting it, processing it. And then when it ends up in a landfill, it decomposes and releases methane, which is a really potent greenhouse gas.
Okay, so that's definitely something I can work on. We've talked about energy, agriculture. What about industry? That seems like it must be a big emitter too.
Oh yeah, industry is a big one for sure. Producing things like cement and steel takes a ton of energy, and a lot of that energy comes from fossil fuels. But there's some really cool stuff happening in this area.
Like what?
Well, there's a lot of research going on in carbon capture and storage. It's basically capturing the carbon dioxide that comes out of power plants and factories and storing it underground so it doesn't go into the atmosphere.
Wow, that sounds like something out of a sci-fi movie. It's kind of hopeful to hear that there are so many potential solutions. It seems like we have the tools to fix this?
Yeah, we definitely have the tools and the knowledge. What we need is the will to use them, on a big enough scale. It's got to be a global effort. Governments, businesses, individuals, everyone needs to work together.
So that brings us to adaptation. Dealing with the changes that are already happening. What does that actually look like?
Well, it really depends on the place and the specific impacts they're facing. Like coastal communities, they might build seawalls or raise buildings to protect against sea level rise.
Some places that are already struggling with droughts, they'd probably focus on water conservation and like planting crops that can handle dry conditions, right?
Exactly. Adaptation is all about finding solutions that fit the specific challenges different communities are facing. It's about being prepared and figuring out how to thrive, even with a changing climate.
So mitigation is like preventing the problem from getting worse, and adaptation is about learning to live with the changes we can't stop.
Hmm.
And we need both, right?
You got it. We need both. It's not one or the other. We got to work on reducing emissions and adapting to the changes that are already happening.
Okay, this has been super helpful. I feel like I have a much better understanding of what we can do. But one thing I'm curious about is, like, how does climate change affect different parts of the world? I'm guessing it's not the same everywhere, right?
You're right. Climate change doesn't affect everyone equally. It depends a lot on where you live, the geography, but also the social and economic conditions of the area.
So some places are getting hit harder than others.
Unfortunately, yeah. Like low-lying island nations, they're really vulnerable to sea level rise and extreme weather. And a lot of developing countries, they often don't have the resources to adapt. So they're facing even bigger challenges from things like droughts, floods, and changes in agriculture.
That seems really unfair. The people who contributed the least to causing climate change are often the ones suffering the most.
It's a really complex issue with a lot of, social and ethical dimensions. It shows how important international cooperation is, and we need to make sure that vulnerable communities get the support they need. There's this idea of climate justice, which is really important to consider.
Climate justice. I've heard that term, but I don't really know what it means.
Basically, climate justice recognizes that climate change hits marginalized communities and, the people who contributed the least to the problem the hardest. It's about making sure that our solutions don't just fix the environmental problem, but also create a more just and equitable world for everyone.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's about making sure no one gets left behind. But with such a huge global challenge, how do we get everyone on board? How do we get people to actually take action?
It's definitely a huge challenge, but there are things happening at all levels, from individual actions to, big international agreements.
Like what? Give me some examples.
Well, there's the Paris Agreement. It's a big international agreement that aims to, limit global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. It's basically a way for all the countries in the world to work together to tackle this problem.
I've heard of that, but what does it actually involve?
It's basically a framework for countries to set their own targets for reducing emissions and adapting to climate change. And then, they report on their progress.
So it's like a global promise to work together.
Yeah, pretty much. And then a lot of individual countries also have their own policies and programs. Like some countries are putting a price on carbon emissions, through things like carbon taxes or cap and trade systems.
So we have international agreements, national policies. What about things happening at the local level?
Oh yeah, local action is super important too. Cities and towns, they're often the ones dealing with the impacts of climate change firsthand. So they're doing all sorts of innovative things to cut emissions and adapt.
Like what?
Well, some cities are really investing in public transportation so people don't have to rely on cars as much, or they're promoting energy efficiency in buildings, or creating more green spaces, which helps with things like managing stormwater and reducing the urban heat island effect.
So there's a lot happening on the ground, which is good to hear.
Exactly. And remember, climate action isn't just about governments and big institutions. Individuals can make a difference too.
So besides, unplugging my stuff and trying to reduce food waste, what else can I do?
There's so much you can do. You can support businesses that are committed to sustainability, or you can advocate for policies that address climate change and just make conscious choices in your everyday life to reduce your carbon footprint. And don't underestimate the power of just talking about climate change with your friends and family. The more we talk about it, the more it becomes a normal part of the conversation, and the more we can encourage people to take action.
So basically, stay informed, make good choices, speak up, and spread the word.
That's it. Every little bit helps. We're all in this together.
Wow, This deep dive has been really eye-opening. I feel so much more informed now about what climate change is and what we can do about it. But before we wrap up, I have one more question.
Okay, shoot.
All this talk about mitigation and adaptation, it feels like we're always on the defensive, like trying to fix a problem we created. Is there a way to think about climate action more positively?
That's a fantastic question, and it's something we're going to explore in our final part.
Ooh, I'm intrigued. Looking forward to it. All right, welcome back to our final deep dive on climate change.
It's been quite a journey so far, huh? We started with all the science and the challenges and then got into the solution.
It did. And last time you left us with this question about changing our perspective on climate action. How can we think about it in a more positive way instead of just focusing on the problems and playing defense?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And it gets to the core of how we think about this whole issue. Climate change is urgent, yeah, but it also presents a chance to really reimagine a better future for ourselves and for the planet.
Reimagine a better future. I like that. But how do we actually do that? How do we move beyond just avoiding the worst case scenarios?
Well, we need to realize that climate action isn't just about preventing bad stuff. It's about creating good stuff, too. We got to shift our focus from fear to opportunity, from seeing it as a burden to seeing it as a chance to make things better.
I'm listening. Give me some examples. How can we actually create something positive out of all this?
Think about all the benefits that come with climate solutions. Take renewable energy, for example. Switching to things like solar and wind, that not only cuts emissions, but it also creates jobs, cleans up the air we breathe, and makes our energy supply more secure. It's a win-win-win.
So it's not just about saving the planet. It's about improving our lives in a lot of different ways.
Right. When people see those benefits directly, climate action becomes more appealing. It's not about sacrifice. It's about creating a healthier, cleaner, more prosperous future.
Okay, that makes sense. It's about highlighting those positive impacts. But how do we get that message out there? How do we get people to buy into this more optimistic vision?
I think storytelling is a big part of it. We need to share stories that show the positive changes that are already happening, the successes, the communities, and people who are making a difference.
Yeah, it's about showing those glimmers of hope, those examples that prove we can create a better future.
Exactly. We need to paint a picture of what's possible, not just what we're afraid of. And it's not just about telling those stories. It's about getting people involved in making that future a reality.
What do you mean by that? How can we make climate action more hands-on for people?
It shouldn't be something that's just decided by governments and big organizations. It should be a collaborative effort, something that empowers people and communities to be part of the solution.
I see. When people feel like they're actually part of the process, they're more likely to support it.
Exactly. And when we bring in all sorts of different voices and perspectives, we get more creativity and innovation. We need everyone at the table if we want to create a truly sustainable and equitable future.
Wow. This has been an incredible deep dive. I feel like we've learned so much about climate change, the challenges, the solutions. But most importantly, I think we've discovered a new way of thinking about it, a way that's all about hope and opportunity and the power of working together.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Understanding the problem is the first step, but then it's about seeing the possibilities and, taking action to create a better future for everyone.
That's a great note to end on. Thanks for joining us on this journey into climate change. Remember, every little action counts.
Yeah.
Stay curious, stay engaged, and let's all do our part to build a brighter future.
Absolutely. Until next time, keep learning and keep exploring.